by or research relating to Indigenous Australians undertaken by non or Indigenous Australians. So we've been exceptionally busy. We have determined that we can see ourselves as actually an anchor point for our faculty to be the place, the central place for people to come for support, assistance with their research, or ideas for how to include Indigenous Australians in the body of the research. We are starting to grow. We've just this past week seen the commencement of 3 new postdoctoral fellows, and we have a 4th to commence, which is going to be a co-badged DVC ISS/POSH postdoctoral fellow. She will commence in August. So in a nutshell, we are keen to meet with you and to work with you. We co-host events like this, and we travel across the rural precincts in New South Wales. 2 weeks ago, we were in Kumiala, Dareton, talking to locals and community employees about how we can support community members learning and understanding value of research in the space that could have some very positive impact on their community. The other really exciting thing we do is run a monthly yarning circle across faculty. So as you see that advertised, just yell out and come join us. We talk about all sorts of interesting things. It's a safe place to share anything that we do or don't know. Last week, interestingly, the session was talking about the census data and how relevant the 2 boxes of please tick here if you are Indigenous, yes or no, and please tick here if you have an Indigenous heritage. And the ticking of those boxes was completely bamboozled, and people were bamboozled by that, because there were people who ticked no, I'm not Indigenous, but yes, I have Indigenous heritage. And so what that means for research was really interesting and important. It was a fantastic conversation for those who were there and part of it. If you would like to contact us to talk about anything Indigenous research related, please do so. posh.admin@sydney.edu.au is our email address. We have a web presence under the Faculty of Medicine and Health. On that website, you can just click on the membership button, and please come join us as a member and be invited to the events that we are participating in. And I'm here until about 5 p.m. tonight. So if there's something that you'd like us to get back to you to talk about, please leave your name, number with me, and I'd be delighted to speak with you. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Alison. So we're going to hear from our guest, who's Professor Sarah Flicker from York University. And again, because I know there's been a little confusion, it's York University in Toronto, Canada, not York University in the UK. And then once Sarah has given her presentation, we'll have a talk about it first with 2 responders, Karina Clarkson, who is with the Graduate Diploma of Indigenous Health Promotion here at the university, and Heather McCormack, who's the Senior Program Manager in the New South Wales Health STI Programs Unit. So they'll both give a brief response, and then we'll have a discussion led by the panel, but also, of course, involving you. And if you are joining us online, you will be able to submit your questions or comments using the Q&A function. So without further ado, I would really like to welcome up Professor Sarah Flicker. Do come on up, Sarah, from the Faculty of Environmental Sciences. It's Sciences, isn't it, rather than Society at York. I can't make the clicker work, Sarah. You might be more conversant with the clicker than me. Go backwards. You're going to be so happy when... Here we go. I'm going to stop introducing you and walk away from that mouse.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It is a treat and a pleasure to be here. And I am particularly grateful to those of you who heard me chat like an hour ago and you still came to this talk. So that makes me feel really happy that but it's really, really a delight. And I want to thank Claire for inviting me to be here. And I too am deeply grateful to the past, present, and future Indigenous youth and elders who have been custodians of these territories, as well as the territories I'm going to talk about from back home. So I've been here a month in Australia, and I've spent a lot of time learning and listening, and I am horrified by our shared histories of colonialism, and have learned a lot about that. And I just want to take a moment to just sit with that reality. And so unfortunately, many of the stories I'm going to share around the impacts of colonialism on young people are going to be very familiar to you. And so, but I hope that some of the ways that young people have resisted these histories and narratives and have forged really and imagined and created for themselves beautiful alternative futures might be inspiring to some of your youth here as well. I also want to acknowledge before I get too far that it is extremely unusual for me talking about any of this without my youth partners. And I feel a bit naked because normally I come to these things with a posse of young people, Indigenous young people who tell their own stories, and we work to figure out our collective narrative. So I want you to know that I did do that work at home, and all of the stories I'm going to share are fully shared with permission. But I'm missing my crew today. It was just a bit far to bring them all with me. So I'm going to tell you a little story to back this up, because I'm going to start this talk back in 2006. So that's when I first began my work in and with Indigenous communities. I was a little baby professor. Imagine me, but cuter, younger, better hair. Fewer bags under the eyes. Anyways, I had been trained as an anthropologist and an epidemiologist and a public health scholar. And I was doing what I thought at the time was quite cutting edge, quite fun participatory research with young people. And we had just been contracted by the City of Toronto to help design a sexual health strategy for the City of Toronto. And we had surveyed an incredible number of youth. We had done this in a very grassroots peer research kind of way. We surveyed 1,200 kids, and 90% of them were racialized kids. We were looking specifically to hear from non-white kids about how we could make cultural services more culturally appropriate. And we were really pleased with ourselves that we had done such a great job until we looked at Indigenous representation. And we had really abysmal Indigenous participation. So we'd done a great job reaching all kinds of young people, but the Indigenous community just wanted no part of our survey for lots of fantastic reasons. They were just like, no, thank you, white lady. You can just take your survey and shove it. Very politely though. So they never actually told me to shove it. They were much more, it was just like active passive resistance in a very polite way to let me know that no, thank you. And this was really perplexing to me. It was really interesting to me. And we tried at the time, what I thought at the time, I tried everything. You know, I'd gone to Indigenous organizations. I hired an Indigenous youth peer worker. I did all the things at the time that I thought I was supposed to do. No dice. And then when I went up and I was at a conference and I was presenting this work, I got called out in a very public way by an Indigenous activist in the community who was the research director at the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. And at the time he was like, cool study, but you know, the problem is you, the problem's not us or our youth, and you need to find a different way of like engaging with us, and it's not going to be a survey. So don't ever come knocking on our door with a survey again. And it was a great moment, because it wasn't actually, it was kind of like that Taylor Swift moment. Remember when like Jay-Z gets up on stage and you're like thinking this is so great, and then it's like really not great and you're having that moment. So it was a moment for me where it was a good reconciling moment. And what happened was I went I just invited Randy out for tea. I said, can we please talk? Because I would love to learn. I know now what I don't know. Like I just don't, and I don't know how to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do it better. And how can we do this together? And Randy and I went out for a lot of teas. Took about a year, and together we designed a project together where he said, there's no surveys. We start with art, we start with talents, we start with strengths, and we start with conversations. And we're going to do this in community in a totally different way. And if you want to do research with us, you have to like unlearn everything you thought you knew. And so that's where we started. Okay, let's see if I can make this go. Okay, so much like here in Australia, colonialism has impacted every aspect of young people's lives, particularly Indigenous young people, from the first point of contact through to every institution, police, health, education, interpersonal violence. Indigenous kids have higher risk factors and rates of vulnerability through all of these systems. And we also had in Canada, much like your stolen generation, we had this horrible national policy where kids were ripped from their homes, ripped from their communities, sent off to residential school systems that were largely run by the church, where they were by and large horrifically abused, and if they survived at all. So we have this awful legacy. The policy around residential schools ended in the 90s. It's not ancient history, it's very recent. And recently in Canada, we've had this national reckoning, and we have found unmarked grave sites at many of these residential schools. And it's now a process where they are excavating the grounds of former residential schools to find these undocumented children's bodies. So this is a horrific national history that sort of permeates all aspects of thinking about Indigenous young people and relationships with the state and relationships with just about every institution. So this is kind of the background and backdrop to doing this work and to thinking about what it meant. So back in 2006, and I've highlighted in red where things have changed, Indigenous people in Canada represented about 3% of the population, but 9% of new HIV infections, and have contracted HIV approximately 10 years younger than non-Indigenous kids. So it was a phenomenon where young people were seroconverting as teenagers rather than in their 20s, and with significant gaps in culturally safe prevention services. Now, one of the big challenges about doing Indigenous HIV prevention work then and now, it continues to be, is we're going to have a little participatory moment together now. So how is HIV transmitted? Friends? Anybody? Blood? Yes, thank you. Blood, so sharing needles. Sex. Big driver between needles and sex, right? So if you don't want to get HIV, what do? Don't have sex, abstinence. Don't use needles, so abstinence is a big one. But if you're going to have sex, what do? Be faithful, right? Be faithful, because this is going to do you great wonders, or condomize, right? So the ABCs of HIV prevention, right? Okay, so this is what public health tells us we're supposed to tell kids. Don't do it. If you do it, make sure you're monogamous and heterosexual. And if you're really naughty, use a condom to, keep it on the DL. Okay, the problem with using condoms, well, there's like a million problems with using condoms, but one of the big problems with using condoms is also you don't get pregnant, even if you want to get pregnant, because condoms, right? So the challenge for many Indigenous youth and many Indigenous communities is that these ABCs look an awful lot like what the church was telling them for a very long time, right? So the messaging of public health has a very strong Christian undertone. And we know that the Christian undertone was a big, or overtone, right, was a big part of the residential school system. So when white people went into Indigenous communities to offer this brilliant public health wisdom of ABCs, you know what we got? La, 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 like very appropriately, because they wanted no part in these conversations because it was echoing. So we needed to think totally differently about how we would even initiate a conversation that started from a totally different starting place. We couldn't start with the conventional wisdom because it was just seen as another strategy for eugenics and social control rather than a strategy that would be helpful to kids, even if their kids were at risk. So we had to reimagine and think about how do we both decolonize and indigenize. And I see these two processes as being similar, but also different. How do we first decolonize all our thinking and really be much more humble about expertise and what that means in public health, but also really work through indigenizing and using indigenous concepts of health and well-being and family and community and cosmologies to center our knowledge practices. And this is when I became very interested in participatory visual methodologies. So by participatory visual methodologies, I'm talking about an umbrella term that encompasses a whole variety of methods, such as digital storytelling or photo voice, self-filming, participatory video, that start with putting the camera or the pencil or the marker into youth's hands and letting youth tell us their stories from their own vantage points. So removing the researcher from the center and putting young people into the center and giving them control to create their own narratives. So participatory visual methods borrow from a whole bunch of established and emerging research traditions, from community-based research, Freudian pedagogy, visual sociology, media scholarship, feminist and critical media studies, and Indigenous studies. So we're borrowing from a whole bunch of really critical fields to really develop into this area of participatory and visual methods. What I love about participatory visual methods is that they're modes of inquiry. And what I mean by that is engaging participants and communities to elicit evidence. They're modes of representation and production in the co-creation of knowledge, but they're also brilliant modes of dissemination in terms of knowledge translation and mobilization. So what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that we can ask youth to take a picture of a phenomenon in their lives, tell us about sexuality in your community. We can use those pictures to have conversation about, like, why did you take that picture? Tell me what this picture means. What am I supposed to see in this picture? Do you see the same thing as you see? Let's talk about the pictures and generate knowledge. And then we can put the pictures in a gallery and say, here's what youth are telling us. And the pictures are doing all of these things at once simultaneously and can create really compelling products. And I got very into this idea. And so we started playing with how can we use this different approach to start with youth knowledge. So rather than start with a survey where I had predetermined all the questions and get people to check off the boxes, how do we totally flip that and say, let's go to you in your community, make some art together, and let's learn from the art that you are creating. So nice attributes of participatory visual methods: strength-based, youth-controlled. Youth tell me it's fun, it's accessible and engaging. It can be really useful when words are hard, when it's hard to talk about things. It has this emancipatory potential when used to engage marginalized groups democratically. Like, it has the possibilities of really flipping control, because if they don't want to talk about it, they just won't take a picture of it. Like, if they don't want you to know, they're not going to put it on film, and that's okay because they're in control, right? So we can talk about what's in the picture. We can also talk about what's not in the picture, but they get to decide what we're going to talk about. And it can really disrupt and flatten traditional hierarchies about who's in control and how. So these are some of the benefits, at least in theory. So in our first project together, and again, remember, this is back in 2006. So this is like before everybody had a cell phone. Taking action 1, our goals were to explore the links between colonization and HIV. Because one of the things we were really trying to disrupt is this idea that, like, Indigenous kids are getting HIV at higher rates because of their behavior, rather than because of the environments that shape that behavior. So we were really trying to see, could the kids track this? Did they have an understanding of this? And where were their points of intervention or possibilities for intervention? To build youth capacity in framing HIV prevention. So to flip the script from, like, if we're going to throw the ABCs out, okay, well, what do we have? And what do you want to how do you guys want to talk about this? And to look at whether the arts work. And so these PVM methods that I was possibly very inspired by, like, is it going to work? And I was perfectly ready to hear no. So at the time, so what I knew for certain is surveys were not working. So let's try something else. And this came, of course, in conversation with the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. So We applied for a grant for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. We were very pleased. One of the things about Canada that I know to be true in Australia as well is there's a huge diversity in terms of Indigenous and communities and indigeneity. In Canada, we have over 70 language groups. The difference in land and relationship to land and culture varies widely in the north, in snow-based kinds of cultures, coastal cultures, plains, so what we started to do was get representation and form a youth advisory group from across the country that would represent some of the diversity of Indigenous experience. And through the youth advisors, we then decided to work with 6 different communities to look at exploring these issues together. So what we decided to do is we were going to in every community, we hired a young person to co-design with us and to work with us on, the first step was always a needs assessment in the community where they would talk to their friends and figure out what kind of art do people in the community want to do. Then we would work with that young person to identify Indigenous artists in the community that did the kind of art that those youth wanted to do. Then we put out a call for youth and said, come, we're going to have a weekend where we're going to make art together and we're going to give you real art training from local artists who we paid. And we paid the youth to participate, and these events were super fun. And basically the instructions were to the artists and to the youth, make us something, anything that tells us about HIV in your community. That was it. And in some communities, they did videos. In some communities, they did graffiti, hip hop, photography, muraling, throat singing, which is an Inuk practice that's really beautiful if you've ever heard it, theater. So in every community, it looked a little bit different. They came for the weekend. We created art at the Sunday night. We would invite the whole community out to see the art, have a conversation about it, and then we followed up with the youth a month later. And that was sort of the architecture. So the 3 main findings from this study are that, as it turns out, art was an excellent way to engage youth. Both the process and the product were important. By and large, youth loved working with artists. They thought it was fun. They thought it was engaging. They loved that it could share a message, and they were really proud of the works of art that they created. And many of the works of art actually had quite long-lasting impact. So the mural stayed up for a very long time. One community, they created this hip hop song that played on the radio for a long time. So the theater productions were filmed and had lives. So a lot of the art had quite long lives, and a lot of the young people and the community members told us that it was a great way of talking about HIV because they were proud of it and it came from them rather than came from us. The second, and this will not surprise many of you at all, is that youth had deeply sophisticated understandings about the links between colonization and HIV. And we're able to map it in a whole variety of ways. You see 2 examples here, like a flow chart. You also see comics. I have tons and tons of examples of this. And this is very unique to Indigenous youth, because when I tried this game with other groups of youth, they were not able to map these connections. So this was a finding that was super interesting to us. And they were able to really identify key places where we could intervene in this trajectory. Lastly, we heard over and over again that the youth wanted more opportunities to get together with youth from other communities to learn, connect, and make art. That they liked getting together with youth in their own communities, but they also wanted to connect with other youth and form sort of national kind of conversations. They were very interested in what youth in different communities had made. There was also in many of these communities a dearth of arts programming. And so just having arts programming, regardless of what they were like, we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. You want us to talk about HIV, great, sex, great, smoking, whatever, just bring on the artists and give us the funding to do it. So that was interesting. And lastly, we got a lot of feedback of we're tired about talking about all the bad stuff. We want to focus on what's good. And we want more stuff like this to do that. So that was really inspiring to us, and we kept going. So we applied for another grant, as one does, right? We're like, okay, this seems to be a model. And in this phase of the project, we flipped it. So now we really took that strength-based message to heart, and we wanted to understand what inspires some young people to become active around HIV prevention. And we sought out activists from across the country. And our goal was to explore digital storytelling. So we brought activists from across the country together to York University for a week of like a intensive residence where they got to create and tell their own stories. And the goal was tell your story that we can share with other youth. So whatever story it is you want to tell us about HIV activism, we're here for it. But keep in mind that our audience is other young people. We want to be able to share your story as inspirational. So that was the kind of parameters of it. So we did the recruitment. We did a bunch of remote preparation. Like this was in the time before Zoom was really popular. So this was all done by phone. It wasn't even Skype time yet. So we were really in the dark ages in 2011. And then we brought them to York University to do this digital storytelling workshop. And then we did this thing, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about this, where we screened stories across the country, and we held movie nights in all the communities to share the stories and inspire conversations and dialogues with other youth. And then we held a collaborative analysis retreat to be like, what does this all mean, and what do we do with all this? So once again, we got youth from across the country. We were looking for diverse representation, and you can see how we did that here. And for those of you who are a little bit, although I'm sure now everybody knows everybody knows what digital story is. Has everybody here seen a digital story? Yeah. Okay. So basically, we followed like the Berkeley digital storytelling cookbook. You know, there's that cookbook out there. And the idea is you gather images, you write your narrative, you record your narrative, you put the pictures in, and you do this in a at the time we needed a lab. Like we had to book a computer lab to do this, and we got editing software. We taught them the editing software to kind of make their films. And I'm talking about this because technology has changed so much that the idea that we would need to book a lab to create a digital storytelling is like absurd today. It can all be done on your phone. Like everybody's phone here could do this, but at, history 2010. Okay. That's my timing. I want to show you Michael's story, but I'm not going to show you Michael's story, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened. So we got all the stories. We've got 18 incredible stories. What was amazing about all these stories is not a single one mentioned abstinence, be faithful, or condomizing. Condoms, completely absent, totally absent. What they all talked about was what was going on for them in their lives. So Michael is a young man who lives with HIV, and he talked about his healing journey and how HIV became a gift for him because he was able to then go out into his community and share his experience to prevent other youth from having the same experience. And it's a gorgeous, poetic film. But people told all kinds of stories. People told stories about environmental activism. People told stories about returning to the land. People told stories about learning to fish. People told all kinds of stories. And I would say out of the 18, I want to say only like 4 of them actually even mentioned HIV specifically. So many of them talked about health and well-being, addictions, family, community. And as a collection of stories, when we brought youth together, we asked them to identify themes across their stories. And these are the themes that they identified. And you'll see that they are not themes that would normally show up in HIV prevention. They're totally different. And these were the themes they identified. And then they decided which of their films belonged in each of these categories. And what we worked on is creating a curated movie film screening. So if you wanted to say, for instance, screen Stay Strong, Stay Sexy, Stay Native, there would be 5 films, and they wrote questions that you could ask after watching the films, and like how games you could play with the films. And so we created this guide that went out to communities around these various themes, which then helped them do their movie nights. So the infrastructure here this was part of our original grant, was every youth got $500 to stage a movie night. They could do whatever they wanted. Some of them went to conferences and screened their films at conferences. Some of them invited like 10 kids to their basement and watched in their basement and ate so much junk food. Some of them did it in community centers. Some of them, you name it, they ran the full gamut of what they looked like. The one parameter was you had to organize something where some films were screened, and a member of our research team flew out to support you. And support sometimes looked like driving around to buy snacks. Sometimes it looked like sitting in the back of the room. Sometimes it looked like phoning up friends like the day of because they forgot to invite people. Like it ran the full gamut of what would happen for support. And one of the things we invited people to do at the screenings, if they felt comfortable, was come up and record what they thought of the screening. And there was no interview schedule. It was literally like a handheld mic situation. We called it the MTV box, again, very old reference, and just ask people to record, tell us what they thought. So, and people did. What was amazing is the ways that people came in to talk about it, because I'm going to share a little bit. So we wanted to study the impact, like, okay, so what happens here? What does this look like? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the themes here in terms of what this looks like. So first, and then we also interviewed the youth. So I will say that at that final retreat, we had in-depth interviews with all 18 youth. So most of the youth talked about the experience being transformative for them personally in a number of ways. For some, telling their stories was deeply personal work. The process helped them connect with their communities, histories, and cultures in really meaningful ways. And some talked about very difficult identity challenges and how this project made them proud to be Indigenous in a way that they hadn't felt connected to before. Others talked about crediting the project with helping them connect with Indigenous teachings, languages, resources, and elders, because they went searching for that for their story. But most importantly, the process of coming together to tell and share stories help youth tap into their important leadership opportunities. And many got hooked into this larger network of 18 youth leaders across the country that led them on all these other journeys around activism, including activism around climate justice, which is a huge issue for us. I know it's a huge issue for you. Land rights. One youth ended up going to speak at the UN. Another spoke on a CBC documentary. Meanwhile, others have facilitated and shared their art and digital storytellings at gatherings and conferences, and elders put them up for awards, film festivals. And they ended up joining a whole bunch of other national and regional youth networks. So just the process of coming together with other leaders helped them leapfrog into other more and more leadership opportunities. And I would say most of them are still in touch today. What's wild is, again, this is 2011, many of them are still in touch today. So the other piece we really saw is that in a lot of these communities, HIV was a very taboo topic that people did not want to talk about. But when their youth were the ones who were centered in leading the conversation, many family and community members came out to say how proud they were of these young people. And the interest and engagement of family and community members was often central for getting the movie nights off the ground. So it was not unusual for like moms to cook, or uncles to get the lodge, or someone to invite an elder to come in and drum. And that drew in community assets and conversations around pride of these young people that it just would have been very difficult to go in any other kind of way. So families and communities really came together. So for instance, in one community, the local health center contributed door prizes and giveaways that were presented at the movie night. In another community in Goose Bay, they brought in youth bands and youth talent. So like after the movie night, there were other youth who got to highlight so they used it as really opportunities to gather and showcase it. And in this picture, you see Dale, one of our youth, who was gifted an eagle feather by an elder in his community as a sign of his leadership, which is a real culturally important kind of rite of passage. So the other piece that ended up happening were the digital stories became launch pads for sex education. So even though almost none of them would at all look like a conventional sex ed moment, what happened after the stories is that people came with their questions. And in their questions, they did ask things like, how could I prevent HIV? And so it really flipped the script on the possibilities around sexual health education and the kinds of questions you could ask. This young woman, Alexa, decided she was going to create a sexy health carnival and created this amazing carnival. And you can see some of the booths here. That was so popular in her community that we ended up getting another giant grant, $500,000 from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to take the Sexy Health Carnival on the road. And we ended up getting 2 or 3 grants afterwards. So anyways, Alexa and I are still collaborating on Sexy Health Carnival grants. She is now a physician in her own community with a specializing in Indigenous and rural health. And she really talks about how it was the movie night that got her going. I mean, she was going places either way, right? Like we recruited amazing young people because they were leaders, but the fact that we were able to provide all that support really became a catalyst for them kind of continuing on. I won't say that it was always, a slam dunk. And I will say we actually got a fair bit of resistance from public health. What was amazing is that was the place we got the most resistance. And then especially in some of these fly-in communities where we tried to access additional resources from public health and public health nurses came, we didn't always get great results. So here, this is a quote from one of the public health experts who had flown out to a northern community. And at first she was really mad. She was like, I am a public health expert and this was not a good HIV prevention, activity. I saw no condoms. I didn't see any needles. Like, how could you do this? Like, how could you use my money in this way? And we were all kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's disappointing. Oh, well. But the great thing is with a fly-in community, you get multiple points of access because she wasn't getting out of the community before we were. Like we all had to be on the same plane. So the next morning, she had slept on it. And she had had an opportunity to talk to a whole bunch of people over breakfast in the community who were buzzing about how great that discussion was and asked her, like, when are we going to do more HIV programming in the community? And no one had ever asked her that question before. And so she came around and she brought some of the youth leaders from other communities back to her community later to continue on in the discussion. So it wasn't always like an immediate slam dunk. Sometimes it took a little minute for people to kind of catch on, but that, it was a win eventually. So I think what these stories illustrate is that the diverse range of approaches that Indigenous youth use to take up the theme of HIV prevention. In every case, they created pieces that challenged the status quo and sparked new kinds of conversations, one that placed the virus in the context of health, community, culture, change, and agency. And what these approaches stress is that the communal must engage with the historic and ongoing oppression to actually begin to make a difference. So I want to say that the story continues because I continue to collaborate with a bunch of these young people in some of their offshoot projects. Just recently, I wrote another grant with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and one of the Taking Action youth is now a professor of Indigenous health at the University of Victoria, and she led the grant. So I talked a little bit about that this morning, but it was such a pleasure to be able to see the way these youth are now taking leadership positions and flying, and I get to take a backseat. My whole goal in this journey of working in Indigenous health has been to write myself out of a job by mentoring a new generation of brilliant scholars. And I'm just so proud of that grant we received to develop a two-spirit bundle for young people, for queer Indigenous young people in Canada. Okay, so I want to very briefly, I think I have about 7 more minutes if I'm being careful here, talk about some of the journey since then and the ways we've been innovating on different kinds of methods. So I have become obsessed with cell phones and the possibilities of cell phones. And I have moved all my practices of digital storytelling now into what we're calling cell filming. So making films on phones in response to research prompts. Very similar to digital storytelling is thinking about a prompt, brainstorming the prompt, always talking about anonymity strategies, creating a storyboard, having a discussion about ethics, very important, filming and editing or not editing, because you can do one-shot videos and youth are very good at this, and then using the creations, the films, to watch and discuss and disseminate and archive and using these products in with communities. So an example of like the storyboard, which doesn't have to be a big fancy document. It can be done with markers and papers. And thinking about how you can use the individual cell films, you can use them for participatory analysis. I've also become quite obsessed with composite video making, which is taking snippets of a bunch of people's videos to create short documentaries and sort of doing mix and matching. And I'm using the metaphor of quilting here to sort of think about that. But I realize it's a weird, crafty mishmash of metaphors all at once, but you know, bear with me. And I'm going to end with talking a little bit about my work with the Young Indigenous Women's Utopia, which is a sister project that I've been working on. And this is like my favorite project. It is working with a group of young Indigenous girls in Treaty 6 territory, which is in Saskatoon, Canada. And we've been working on how do we combat gender-based violence and colonial violence in their community. So when I started working with them, they were all 12 and 13. They're all now 16, 17. Many of them are graduating high school. But I want to show you like one video because you can't do a talk on participatory visual methods without sharing a little bit of their work. So here we go. Hopefully this works. Oh, sorry, did it on the wrong computer. Apologies. Okay, let's see if I can get it working on here.
When we go in the bathroom, we look in the mirror. We don't think we are good enough, pretty enough, smart, or thin, but we are beautiful, good, smart, strong. We are girls.
When we go into the bathroom and look in the mirror, we see ourselves. We don't think we're good enough, or pretty enough, or smart enough, or thin, but we are beautiful, good, smart, and strong.
I am fat. I am one of a kind.
I'm worthless. I will never be anything.
I'm just playing. I'm not worthless.
I am so ugly. I am not smart. I am so fat. I am beautiful.
When I go to 20th Street, I feel scared because there are Johns and they try to pick me up. It's unsafe because guys honk at me and call me names like hottie and sexy. I feel uncomfortable, stared at. I'm sad for the women who work in the street. I am scared for them, and I wish they didn't have to be in the sex trade.
Don't tell me you want me, need me or love me. This is not because I'm no longer your lady.
Just because I'm wearing black and white doesn't mean I'm in a gang.
Hey, way
Indigenous girls go to the mall and we get followed because we are a different color and people think we are bad, plus steal things from them. But really, we just are here to shop like normal people, and we don't want to feel uncomfortable every time we go to the mall or any other outings.
love's been thrown out the door. Don't tell me you want me, need me or love me, because I'm no longer your baby. Hey oh, hey oh, hey oh, hey way I oh, hey way oh, hey, hey way I oh, way oh, hey, I oh.
We struggle, but we survive.
Our history is dark, but we are the light.
We are strong.
We are beautiful.
We are smart.
We are
A square.
a square.
We are Indigenous girls.
Woo!
I know, right? Yeah, they deserve a little round of applause. So a couple of things about that video, and I'm just gonna highlight a few things. Number one, obviously, they're kids who are doing this all on their cell phone. It doesn't take a lot of high tech. The prompt was around gender-based violence, but you could see they talked about all kinds of different violence in their life, and they see them as totally connected. And we have shown this video hundreds of times in the community of Saskatoon. And the goal is not to talk necessarily about like what's going on for these girls, but it's used to spark the conversation about what's going on for the girls in the classroom and in the community. And what it always does is it just opens up space, because it starts with these very real, honest, lovely dialogues of vulnerability and storytelling and telling us where they're at, which then leads us into all kinds of conversations that are just so different than if we started in other kinds of ways. So it's just a really beautiful example of like, it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be slick. It doesn't have to be like a polished social marketing campaign. It can be really grassroots to kind of do the job of connecting, which is really what these methods are all about. So very briefly, a couple of other things we've been working on. We've been using ribbon skirt workshops to open up conversations about reclaiming culture and honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women through red skirts. And so we taught the girls, we brought in elders who taught the girls how to sew traditional ribbon skirts. When I say we, like, I do not do this. Like I write the grants to bring in the people to do the cultural teachings. And then they've been facilitating these little mini ribbon skirt workshops throughout the community. And we've been having like pop-up gallery spaces where we put these, and those ribbon skirts, we flew the girls out to York University where they worked with my students, and we have these hanging little mini ribbon skirts like all over my faculty right now as a lasting kind of legacy of their work. They decided they wanted more Indigenous representation in downtown Saskatoon because they felt like their presence was invisible, and we got funding from the city to create a mural. And this is the mural that they put up last spring, and we got a lot of attention on that. They wrote a book recently, and we've had some book launches, and it's a really beautiful, it's all their stories. So we had that self-published, and they've been really, really proud of that. And the girls themselves have been leading marches, leading workshops, and they've won a whole bunch of both local, provincial, and national awards for their advocacy and efforts. So it's been really fun working with them on this journey and having that long-term relationship. And we've been writing about all of it. So I think being really creative with the methods we use for engaging young people and following their dreams and talents has been part of the joy. So that concludes my talk.
Thank you so much, Sarah. If you'd like to pull a chair up, actually, or you'll have to stay here, but you might like to be with everybody on the panel. I'm going to ask our panelists to come and join us on the less comfortable high stools. And I will be providing you with microphones. Let me first introduce our panel, and then we'll ask them to give a brief response one at a time. And then we'll be open to your questions, or the panel can place questions to Sarah or vice versa online. Please feel welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A function. So next to me on our panel, getting mic'd up as we speak, is Heather McCormack, who is the Senior Program Manager at the New South Wales STI Programs Unit, the Centre for Population Health. Heather is a proud Wiradjuri woman with 15 years experience as a health communications specialist in sexual health and bloodborne virus sector. She's Senior Program Manager, as I've said, and a current PhD candidate exploring strategies to optimise STI and HIV screening in routine care at the Kirby Institute. Heather's work with the New South Wales STI Programs Unit brings together digital communications tools and strengths-based health promotion, which is absolutely my favourite kind of health promotion, to improve sexual health outcomes for Aboriginal young people and other priority populations. So totally in the same wheelhouse. And next to Heather and in between in the middle is Corinna Clarkson, a proud Gamilaroi Dunghutti woman from New South Wales. She's Associate Lecturer with the Indigenous Public Health Team at the University of Sydney, and she has more than 15 years experience in the alcohol and other drug and social and emotional wellbeing, mental health sectors, all of those pieces that travel together in various roles, lots and lots of professional experience. Primarily, Corinna has been teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in the area of health and wellbeing, with a passion for building capacity and capability of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals, families and communities, and other students who get to benefit from her now, through strengths-based teaching approaches. And she's about to commence a Master of Philosophy exploring the impacts of cultural load on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander alcohol and other drug workforce in New South Wales. So thank you to our panelists. Welcome. Corinna, you have the microphone, so I'm going to ask you to go first. Oh, that's true. You have a less visible. I'm still picking Corinna. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, it's really hard to respond to that because it was so empowering. I think just really, I guess, I don't know. I feel like I have more than one question, but I don't know if they're questions or because I feel like you may have already answered. But so maybe more comments or statements. Just, I think it was really wonderful to see how you explored, and I think this overlaps because I was at this morning's session. So apologies for those of you that weren't here this morning because some of it sort of overlaps. What I really love about what you do is how you challenge, like you're open to being challenged and you're open to sitting in a space of discomfort. And it was a conversation we had at one of our tables. Sorry, there's someone sitting here that was with me this morning, is, about inviting people to be vulnerable. And I think when you talk about a national reckoning, it's definitely something here in Australia that's way overdue. And but how they all intersect in terms of empowering our youth to now become strong leaders. And as an artist and someone who's a little creative, who also works in prevention and health promotion, like really early stages of research career, just found it really inspiring and motivating to hear about your amazing work. So I'm not sure if that was exactly what I was supposed to say or do, but so rather than a question or a statement, I guess I just want to say thank you for our unlearning and relearning, and being able to share that with everyone here in terms of promoting, I guess, Indigenising research, essentially, in a nutshell, because we often talk about decolonising, which is that deficit approach to undoing things, but there is a push to actually Indigenise research and spaces, and because that creates more safety for our communities.
Thank you so much for articulating much of what I feel. I often have wanted to say just, thanks, Sarah, in those same ways. And to say that, we start in this place where we feel like these methods might make a research space more culturally safe or culturally open, but actually it's liberating for all of us, researchers no less. Heather.
So I have a question, but it's kind of a question that has a bit of a prologue. So, so I was invited to come along today because I lead a program that's called Paperwatch, which is it's a partnership between New South Wales Health and the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council of New South Wales, and presently the flagship New South Wales Health campaign health communication program targeting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people with sexual promotion. And Paperwatch and Methodologies, when I presented at conferences or we screen the campaign, people are always really impressed by the production values and the quality of the, like, it's a humor-based campaign. It uses comedy to kind of circumvent stigma and shame and make those uncomfortable conversations a little more powerful. People feel like they can talk about difficult topics, that they can have a laugh about them. But what a lot of people are less aware of is that before I started with the XJ program, and to go to take action, the program actually started as a really tiny micro budget. Its budget was like, you know, $2,000, and I'm just going to give you that.
Sorry about that. So the program started with a really, really small budget, and we were lucky to get program ambassadors in the first couple of years who were kind of like rising stars. So they came onto our program when they were just starting to get famous, and then they got famous and kind of took our program with them. But in those early days when we were relying really heavily on organic reach and organic engagement, there was, I guess you'd call them capacity building components, where we partnered with local stakeholders to get the comedy ambassadors to do kind of little workshops with local Aboriginal young people to teach them to do their own comedy skits about sexual health. And there was a little education component, and getting, like, you know, training young people in the comedy, and then they would write their own scripts and perform them and film them. And as social media content, it didn't do very well. But as a participatory activity, it was incredibly valuable. And the young people said they got so much out of the process. So then a couple of years later, when we put in for increased funding, and that ended up being a much more complicated process than anyone expected, but it's a government program, so perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised. But we came back with a much greater amount of funding that allowed us to invest more heavily in paid media spend and high production values. But part of that was that we had to cut out the bits that were perceived lower ROI. So the bits where, like, you're meeting in community halls with young people around the state, and you're doing a little workshop, and they're making videos that no one's really going to see. From the perspective of the government being counters, that was perceived as not being particularly high value. And where I'm kind of leading here is that question of scale, when you're taking a small grassroots program and building it up to something with broader reach, and maybe having to cut off some things that had that, like, more individual benefit, but less of a population level benefit. Is that something that you've found in your own work?
Such a good question. No, and it's such an interesting question. And I often talk and think about this in terms of like a dose response, right? And I think the value that you get from that deeper engagement, from going to that workshop, from sitting with it, it's just different than the value you get from, like, consuming something funny for 6 minutes or 10 seconds. I don't know how long the videos are. And I think there has to be room for both, right? There has to be room for the, like, get the message out to a mass audience, especially in ways that they can hear it. Like, that's brilliant, but also room for that deeper engagement. And I might argue that the higher risk the young people are, the more they deeply need that deeper engagement to counteract all the other messaging they're getting, right? So, like, I would say it's not an either or. Like, how can it be an and, you know, and just advocate for thinking about the creativity? Because one of the things, and we've experimented with different models in some of the art making, and in one of the models, we hired a very slick company to come in and make a really slick video with the youth. And it's beautiful, and the production value is so strong. But in our evaluation of it, it didn't have much more of an impact than, like, the cell films that the kids were making, right? Like, so, and again, we were comparing the two processes with the youth and the community's impact. Like it wasn't a national thing. Like, where is this, how is this impacting in other communities? But it seems to me that it doesn't always require like super fancy, super slick budgets. That a lot of young people have, like, you know, the phone in their pocket that can do a lot of the work, or the markers already in their drawer that can do a lot of the work. And it's more often about how can we create spaces where they can come together and do that work in ways that are non-stigmatizing, in ways that are strength-based, in ways that they can feel proud of who they are. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I love the question.
It kind of does, because the strategy that we've taken to kind of address the perceived gap that we got when we lost that that component of the program. I was really happy to see the Sexy Health Carnival. I read the paper that you wrote about that. We've incorporated kind of activations at cultural community events into the program. And we've engaged a network of young Aboriginal people as peer educators. So we've got those that are like community engagement efforts happening at those community events. And people are having like the kind of deeper, richer conversations that are reinforcing the campaign messaging. And that carnival is something I'm really interested in hearing about more, because it's kind of like the activations that we're doing at the community events to a much larger scale.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about the Sexy Health Carnival. So it's funny, it grew out of the Taking Action movie night, and it's now the #1 program of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. So yeah, those guys are brilliant, and they've just like run. And so the carnival is a series of booths and topics. And it's like, there's a menstruation booth, there's a mental health booth, there's a masturbation booth. Like there's like, I don't know, I think there's like 15 different booths. And when they go places, they take them to powwows, which are a big cultural. Do you guys have powwows? No, not a thing here. Okay. So powwow is a First Nation gathering of multiple nations, where you'll have a variety of it's basically a festival. Think music festival meets culture, and they'll have like dances, like traditional dances and traditional ceremonies. And it's like a multi-day festival where multiple nations come together and gather. And so the grant we got was to take the Sexy Health Carnival on the powwow trail. And then at each powwow, we do some needs assessments before we go. We decide which booths to bring. And some are way more popular than others. No one ever wants the HIV booth. They all want the masturbation booth. It's great. And then we do cultural adaptations depending where we are in the country. So different animals will resonate on the coastal regions than on the prairie regions, right? And different languages are spoken. So there's like on the masturbation booth, there's like a whole, I think it's pin the nipple on the chest or something, but like you have to know all the body parts in your language, or you learn all the body parts in like the local language. So it's adapted for each kind of place you go. And we train youth in every community we go to help co-run the carnival and hire youth in the community. And then because it's a research grant, we did these like evaluation surveys, because the youth told us to do the surveys this time, but it's like on an iPad, so it's super fun, and they get paid a lot of money to do it, so they did it for us. But to look at should we be having these discussions at all at powwows, because that was the first controversy. There was a lot of controversy about whether or not sexual and reproductive health information belongs at powwows, because powwows are ceremonial places. But one of the things we know about powwows is because many nations come together and they all camp out, a lot of sex and drugs happens at powwows. Like people are getting together and they're hooking up. And so it's a really important place to be having health promotion kind of conversations from a cultural perspective, even though there's a lot of pushback, particularly from elders who have been to residential schools and have a strong Christian legacy. around, is this cultural knowledge appropriate in these places? So it brings up a lot of controversy. But what I will say, kind of going back to your earlier point, is in our evaluation studies, the people that have them that get the most from it are the peer workers we hire, and we like spend 3 days training, and who work the powwow, and we purposely try to find young people who are having a really tough time in the community, or who we know are at who are active users, or who are queer and maybe engaging in higher risk activities or sex work, or we try to find those kids, because we know if we're going to be investing in the training and that kind of intensity, then those are the kids we really want to bring in. And we see that that's where the biggest benefit is. So I think, anyways, it's a totally brilliant program. I give full, it's Alexa's baby. She's amazing. I just write the
Can I also just invite questions from the floor if there are people here who would have some, and for the panel as well. Yeah, yes, please do.
Thank you. In regards to your HIV, example, which is fascinating, when at the beginning of your journey, you started with ABC and it didn't work, and then you did that project, and then so first of all, can I ask, did the HIV incidence decrease after that project? And if so, was it because there is an indigenous way of preventing HIV, or is it just coating ABC with a different way so it make it more palatable? Which one is it? Thank you.
No, it's a great question, and it is sort of a bit beyond the scope, because we didn't actually measure, we didn't look at HIV incidence. And one of the big challenges with HIV prevention messaging is a really good prevention campaign always raises the rate of HIV in a community, because people go and get tested. And then when people go get tested, you have higher numbers. And so it always looks like prevention fails. So it was true that in many of the communities we visited, we saw higher rates of HIV in the subsequent year. But I strongly believe that is because we did a really good job encouraging people to get tested, rather than because we were encouraging HIV transmission. But that wasn't one of the goals we were studying. So I can't necessarily speak directly to that. But it is very complicated around all STI prevention campaigns, as they often spike prevalence rates in really counterintuitive ways.
Is there any questions from the chat?
Oh, I just have a really quick one. Given that this sort of was established as a research project, and from what you've said so far, seems to be an ongoing research project, in terms of the lifespan, how do you sustain the funding? I mean, you said you spent a lot of time writing the grants, but given the success of this being ongoing since 2006 to 11, what I guess, what's your secret in terms of having funding that's so flexible that is able to deliver this program?
It's not flexible. I've written a lot of 3-year grants. So we can write a grant that goes, well, some of them are 7-year grants, some of them are 3-year grants, some of them are 1 year, 2. I just write a lot of grants. And I write them with the community, and because I've been working with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network for so long, they come to me, the grants originally in the first iteration of the grant, I, approached them, and with the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, which is an adult run network, and we begged them to come on. And now they come to me and are like, this is our next project, help us, which is a great flip. I love it. And I think I mentioned earlier that we've now successfully trained doctors and PhDs that are Indigenous through the network and through these projects. And now they're leading, and I get to support. And that's like, it's the best. Like, I love it. And so figuring out strategies to kind of continue to support them in their work is kind of how we go about it. But yes, it's a lot of time grant writing.
We wish there had been an easier answer there, Sarah. You really disappointed us. No. Julia, is there anything from online? Okay. Yes.
Karen, do you want to unmute and repeat your question?
Yep. You could do it, please, Julie.
Okay. So this is Karen Drysdale, community engaged research superstar. What is the policy uptake of these amazing stories created by First Nations young folk in terms of increasingly we see policy centering narratives of lived experience, or how contemporary policy mobilizes individual narratives and lived experience through the growing use of biographical stories? Are these taken up by policy, and how to keep young folks' agency over their own stories as front and center?
Those are two great questions, and I'll take the second one first. So I didn't talk a lot about ethics today, but I think there's like a whole conversation to be had about ethics and thinking through the ethics of this work. So a few things is, I never share a video that a young person doesn't want shared. So even though in like the digital storytelling project, we had explicitly told people, like, you're making these videos to share. One of the young women made a video. It was about sexual abuse in her life. And right after she made the video, she was like, I never want anyone to see that again. I was like, cool, done. Like, you made the video, it's your video, you get full control. So the important thing is that the young people who are both featured and or creators of all the media get to decide what happens to it. And by what happens to it, I mean, like, it gets destroyed immediately, gets put on the internet, gets taken down when they want it taken down. And of course, youth's lives change over time, and things they're really proud of when they're 13, they're no longer proud of when they're 16. And they get to control all that. So that was the first part. The second part about policy, have we seen policy changes? So I think that's I think it's quite a complicated thing to attribute policy change to a particular research project. But what I will say is that the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, I think as a result of being involved in a whole bunch of research studies where they've gotten a lot of publicity and airtime, has also been more and more successful in getting secure other forms of funding, in addition to research funding, that have been core to their organization and get now core funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada, because they have shown that their approach works. So that's kind of a policy change. And we've also seen a lot of shifts in the kinds of programming that public health is willing to fund. So I don't know that it's like our project that did that, but we're certainly part of a zeitgeist across the country that has helped kind of make some of those shifts. It feels weird to be knowing that you're behind me and talking to the camera.
I know. We have time maybe for one question, or from Julie gets to ask a question. And Heather, I didn't know if you had another response to some of the questions earlier, but I thought you might have. And if you did, then great.
So we've taken a different approach to permission in terms of the kind of ethics question about getting people's permission to use their products. And I think this is partly about a kind of tension that there is in the heart of participatory approaches between, are you asking people to engage in creative methods as a research product, or as a kind of a product of the research that you then use later? And I think one of the things we've thought about in some of the projects I've been involved with is that first and foremost, it's a catalyst in a research project. And so we say to people, can we have permission to use this in the research project, and nobody will see it? And so then we might interview people around what it is that they've generated. And then we will ask them later, are you comfortable with us using it in these specific kinds of ways? And that's been interesting to kind of then, because we worried that people might not talk about particular kinds of things because they were imagining they were producing something for an unknown public. So that was a kind of methodology and an ethics kind of issue for us. And I think the other thing we've done is that we've, in one project I was involved with, we treated we said, well, if these young people are artists, how would we deal with this differently? And that was actually that we gave them ownership and we got permission from them to use it. So they have copyright, they hold copyright, and we negotiate copyright access for each of our uses. And that's been an interesting kind of negotiation then in terms of really clearly saying who owns this. But I think it kind of, I guess it made me think about that kind of tension in participatory approaches, about the kind of thing I think you were kind of, the panel's talking about local versus kind of bigger change, and about participatory approaches often having profound local impacts. But we all work in systems that are looking for national, international impacts. But actually, most of us are driven by local concerns. We're looking to make changes in local communities. I think that can be a big tension. I'm wondering about how you navigate that in terms of, you mentioned earlier about kind of writing about process as a kind of, which I presume is kind of like, that's your academic work done. So yeah, I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Oh, they're such good, juicy questions. Oh my goodness. I think another issue that we sort of have danced around to is how much of yourself to put in your work, right? So I think thinking about audience from the beginning has been like, we've played with a bunch of the models that you're talking about, you know, when something goes public, how do you have control? But I think another piece of imagining your audience at the beginning will 100% change the story you're going to tell us. And it's not necessarily like a bad story, or it's just a different story. And I think if there is the possibility that you're going to go public, it's really helpful to think of that up front, because it also plays into anonymity strategies, because there's a lot of things you can do to share a story where you're completely anonymous. And we talk a lot about that in our research, like how do you to put yourself in, to what extent are you recognizable, how do you do that, and do anonymity checks after something is done to make sure that if you wanted to be anonymous. And I think this is also true about, do you get named? Like, does your name go on the, you know, is your first name, your last name, if you're an artist versus if you're a research participant, where those lines get blurred. And increasingly, I see a real shift actually in youth moving much more toward like, no, name me, please. Or you better, like, never mind, please. Like, I want to be named. That's mine. And I love that. And I think it's a big piece of the social media generation, right? Like, they understand what it means to put a video on the internet. Like, that's all they do is put videos of themselves and pictures of themselves on the internet. And they know the difference between being anonymous and not anonymous. So I think, you know, that's a big piece of it. And I think so the second question about policy change and thinking about like, how do you fuel like national policy change? It's such a, like, it's like the big golden goose, right? Like, we all want to do that. But in a lot of ways, I think these really micro projects that are very local, it's a longer game toward the national policy questions, but it's like training a new generation of youth to like do something different. And it might take 10 years, but I think we are impacting the national audience, because we have a different generation of politicized young people who are connected, who are skilled, who are getting degrees. And it is refreshing to walk into some of these national meetings now and see like just the color of the faces around the table are different. And it's a result of like that very kind of slow, steady local investment in capacity. So I don't see them as like, I see them as connected in a really powerful but slow, patient kind of way.
Please.
Yeah, I think just the comment you made before about kind of purposefully engaging young people as peer educators who came from marginalized backgrounds or who had particular experiences. We've very deliberately partnered with LGBTQIA+ Aboriginal organization to recruit our peer educators, because so there's a cultural factor here. I don't know if First Nations young people in Canada have the same cultural challenges we have in Australia around shame and taboo when talking about sexual topics. But that's a that's a very big thing for our young people, and particularly our heterosexual young people. But we find that LGBTQIA plus young people have, just by the nature of the lives they have lived to that point, they have a greater level of comfort in discussing sexual matters. And the position that I've advocated for is that I feel this is something that our heterosexual young people can learn from LGBTQIA plus young people. I feel like young queer mob have something really valuable to teach the young heterosexual people about kind of sitting with a little more comfort and a little more playfulness around those topics of sex that they're often engaging with on a deeply shameful level due to the way they've been raised to talk about those topics. Yeah, that was just the comment I wanted to make.
I love the flip. Like expertise. That's a great flip.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's 4:30. It was a great discussion as always. You know, you feel like you're stopping just when it gets warmed up. Although in Sarah's case, we've made her talk a fair amount today, and I hear your voice getting raspy. So if we can have the slide with the closing slide now, I just would flip through a couple more because Sarah's provided lots of resources. Can we have copies of these slides? Right, there we go. So if you're online or if you're in the room, you're happy to do the event evaluation, that would be awesome. You can still do it if you're watching this as a recording. And while you're dutifully adhering to the institutional requirements of these events, I just want to thank you for coming and being here for the conversation with us. And really want to thank our two panel members who just had such insightful things to say and who made me really want to be hanging out for an hour and a half in the pub, like listening to these conversations more and learning a lot. And I also really, really, really want to thank Susie and the network team and Inez, who's been managing all the technology, all the behind the scene work that goes into an event like that. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. And a big shout out to the POSH, and thank you so much for your partnership with us and for the opportunities for enrichment and learning and working together that you continue to put before us. Thanks so much, everyone. There is some refreshments outside. Please do stay and mingle. If you have great ideas for projects, tell Alison and she will tell Michelle, and or tell, you know, Sarah and me if you want to work with us, but you don't have to go work with people at the POSH. If you're not already a member of Sydney Health Ethics Network, you're welcome to join. It's free. You don't need to know anything about ethics, and you can just be interested, and it only really means that you get an email occasionally with cool events like this. Thanks so much, everyone.